So I thought I'd talk about UAP and epistemology and try to put that in the context of this idea of disclosure in terms of government information and offer up my personal thoughts, I guess, to some degree on ways to think about the problem and maybe engage in a little bit of a shared journey on kind of what this means. And in my view, UAP are sort of a leitmotif for critical thinking. And a good example and test case in our each individual professions is to, kind of a sounding board for whether we're actually really critical thinkers or not. And I find myself often checking myself and saying, well, why do I believe that? Maybe I should, re-examine this fundamental premise. So why don't we get started? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the nature of knowledge, the idea of standards of evidence. Gary talked about this a little bit yesterday, so I'll try to amplify maybe a little bit upon that. I don't have any really good data. I'm not going to share any data, so it's all going to be sort of first principles type discussion, but I think that will lead into a process of talking about the disclosure. And so when I say disclosure, I mean, the government probably has better and more information than's publicly available, and maybe we'd like them to share some of that with a broader group. And so disclosure is really about how do we influence the government to come forward with some information. And so there's some context for how to do that maybe. And then circle back into this idea of a taxonomy of UAP origin hypotheses. I would submit even within the government, there's not a consensus or clear understanding of what's happening. There's probably a lot of things happening. And so creating a frame within which to kind of think about that would probably help progress. And then get into a little bit of discussion, personal discussion, I think, about this idea of a hierarchy of being and what does that mean for humanity and this idea of technological singularity and some things to do with that. So I excised or lifted from the internet this picture, which is, I think, an AI-generated version of Raphael's School of Athens in the Vatican in Rome. That was all of the rationalist philosophers, Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. And so, but the AI has taken it and put all the key figures of epistemology in there. So, and I'm not going to venture to try to point out all who they are, but so I thought it was a neat graphic. So what's the nature of knowledge? So you got René Descartes, obviously, I think, therefore I am, so very rationalist perspective. Sextus Empiricus, right? So not really empiricism, but more Pyrrhonism, which is essentially to say that I'm going to withhold judgment if I have two sort of conflicting views. So this, I think the term is atraxia, which is sort of tranquility. So if I'm presented with data that suggests A and suggests not A, then what I'm going to do is basically reserve judgment and basically maintain an open mind and become comfortable with that. So there's sort of, three kind of pathways here. The rationalist pathway, the empirical, like evidence pathway, and then sort of the intermediate pathway, which says I'm going to just reserve judgment. And in some sense, that's probably the more mature approach to take. So epistemology, obviously, as we know, it's the origin of knowledge, the study of the limits of knowledge, the study of the nature of knowledge. And so just to sort of cut to the chase, I went back to Plato and say, what's Plato think about this? So knowledge is justified true belief. And so what's belief? Belief is basically things that we hold to be valid. So then the problem comes in, like, how do we justify this belief? And Hans Albert kind of proposed this thing, the Munchausen trilemma, which people are probably familiar with, right? So Baron von Munchausen, fictional character, does all these crazy things, gets trapped in muck with his horse, and he tries to pull himself out of the muck by his own hair, right? So you get this sort of circular argumentation happening. So Hans Albert sort of suggests that there's sort of beliefs are sort of derived from three categories of thought. The one based on foundational facts, one based that's justified on other beliefs, and then those things that are self-supported. And anybody that's heard me talk before, I've sort of talked about the sort of lines of evidence for this topic that are publicly available. There's the sort of first principles evidence that in some sense sort of aligns with that first category. There's the whistleblower testimonial evidence, and then there's the censored data, right? And just to maybe just throw out a few examples, like, so what would be first principles evidence? And Gary sort of talked on this. How quickly did life evolve on Earth? And, there's been recent scholarship that says it evolved in the Hadean era, which is about 4.1 billion years ago. This is relatively new and not totally accepted, but the Hadean era was before the crust even cooled. The Earth's, 4.5 billion years old. We definitely have stromatolite fossils. In fact, the Science Museum down the road actually has some stromatolite fossils in it that date to 3.5 billion years ago. So at worst, life evolved maybe 400 million years after the crust cooled, but certainly possibly before the crust even cooled. And so almost immediately at the most immediate time. And we find that life can survive in every environment, like undersea vents and in cameras that were supposedly sterilized on probes that landed on Mars, and we've got microbes that can survive in space. So it kind of suggests this idea of, maybe panspermia is a possibility. We've got life that was found in terrestrial rock that was in stasis for 2 billion years, and then they broke the rock open and they found out, it's still alive. So life, is in every environment, pretty much, at least on Earth, can survive in space, evolve very quickly, and maybe can survive in stasis for 2 billion years. And so then you look at how many sun-like stars are in the galaxy. There's 20 million sun-like stars in the galaxy. And there's planets around every star that we've looked at. And the sun is population 1 star, so it's about 5 billion years old. There are population 1 stars that are 10 billion years old. The sun's kind of in the middle. So there's plenty of time for other civilizations to evolve on other planets, even if they follow the same path that we followed. And then the argument, and again, I think Gary talked about this too, can they get here? And certainly they can get here even with sublight travel, even at speeds that we're capable of achieving now. But Einstein's equations are and can be solved to create, a warp drive. Miguel Alcubierre demonstrated that in his graduate thesis in 1994. And it's a valid solution of Einstein's equation. So a lot of people say, effective faster than light travel is not possible. Well, that's false, right? Alcubierre kind of solved the equation for that. It's not an effective solution, right, obviously, but it's possible. It requires negative energy, but negative energy is a thing. We've theoretically predicted it in the 60s, and we measured it in the 90s in the Casimir effect, which is absolutely accepted science. And the expansion of the universe is driven by dark energy, which is, in effect, has all the attributes of negative energy. So there's negative energy everywhere. So from a first principle standpoint, life evolved really fast. It seems pretty common. There are a lot of stars like the sun. There are a lot of planets probably around those stars. And effective faster than light travel is possible. So if you're going to argue against that, you've got a kind of a higher bar to achieve. So in some sense, I would submit that that's sort of the first principles argument and sort of based on these foundational facts. So then you've got justified by other beliefs. So for instance, what's other beliefs? Well, it'd be whistleblowers coming forward and testifying to Congress, right? Admiral Gallaudet testified before Congress. Lou Elizondo testified before Congress. David Grush testified before Congress, right? These people are under oath testifying to the reality of this stuff, right? And they're in positions to know. But you could look at presidents. President Barack Obama, President Trump, they both said UAP are real, right? Haim Eshed, the head of the Israeli Space Force from several years back, said NHI are real. Paul Hellyer from Canada, defense minister, said NHI are real. Gordon Cooper, one of the 7 Mercury astronauts, testified before the United Nations in 1979 that he chased UAP over Germany when he was in the Air Force, and he was the headquarters commander at Edwards Air Force Base. There was actually a landing that they filmed, and you can go Google that, and you can see him in person relating that in a historical way. But he testified before Congress to that effect, just like David Fravor and Ryan Graves testified. And then you've got witnesses testifying to interactions at our ICBM sites where missiles were brought offline in the United States, and then across the world in the Soviet Union at the time, missiles were brought online, and this is substantiated by documents and testimony. And you've got this correlation between observed UAP activity in nuclear sites, incursions in the northern nuclear tier. In fact, there's an agreement between the United States and the former Soviet Union, not a treaty, but an agreement that's still in force, intended to reduce the threat of nuclear war. And it has provisions for use of the Washington-Moscow hotline. And one of the criteria, like the second criteria, is if we detect UFOs in our ballistic missile early warning system, we're going to alert the Soviets to prevent like an exchange, like an inadvertent exchange. And so the first criteria is like, a rogue launch, and the third criteria is like an accidental detonation. So they put this in the kind of sequence there as number 2, as something that's like pretty concerning. So I would say like that kind of falls into this number 2 category. You've got a lot of people, you got a lot of documents, they're saying, this is real. And then you've got sort of the sensor data, right? So we've all seen the videos, the Fleur, the Tic Tac, the Go Fast. Chris Mellon's talked at length about getting more data from NORAD and Space Command. There's many videos out there and increasingly a range of sensor data. So collectively, sort of the reasonable person standard has kind of been met with information that's even publicly available. But what's the problem with this then? So I would suggest the problem is the counter arguments that you encounter, with people that you're trying to sort of engage in this conversation is, foundational facts become a dogmatic argument. In other words, you're like assuming the answer. You're developing an axiom. If life evolved fast here, then it evolved fast someplace else. So then there's NHI. It's sort of like, a dogmatic thing. You're kind of assuming the answer as you're going in. And so the workaround is sort of foundationalism, where logically you accept that there's certain sort of self-evident premises that are inherent in reality, and you're going to build your argumentation on that. But that's the problem. Like, people don't necessarily always accept that. This is sort of the problem with the nature of human knowledge, right? The justified belief becomes a regressive argument, right? Like, so this person said that, and so how did they find out about it? They found out about it by another person, and they found out about it by a document, and then somebody wrote the document, and then, where did they get their information? So it becomes regressive, so you've got to trace it back to the root, and, then the root basically brings you back to argument number 1, like it also often becomes axiomatic. So the workaround by that that's been offered up is infinitism, infinity basically. So as long as the argument's infinitely regressive, then maybe it's valid, right? But there's not enough, there's not an infinite number of people. So ultimately the argument, terminates at some point, and you're back to number 1, and then people claim it's dogmatic, right? And so then you go sort of self-supported, like, what about data, hard facts, right? Well, the trouble is those facts are built on other facts. And so you've got to accept those facts, and then ultimately it starts to become circular. And so the way that's proposed around that is, well, if I can get enough coherent facts together and build this network of coherent facts, then I can have more confidence in that than I might otherwise, like an individual fact pattern or just a chain of facts. I've got to have it within a context, right? But still, like, these problems really aren't resolved, right? This is the challenge with epistemology, right? So I would submit all human knowledge is provisional, right? That's actually the nature of the academy, right? Like, we're continually refining and improving. And so the corollary is there's no such thing as proof, maybe outside pure mathematics, where you're really, accepting the axioms to derive your theory within your formal system. So there's only degrees of confidence, and every person, in my view, maintains their own evidentiary standard. So when somebody listens to a podcast or a speech or a briefing, or reads a document, and they're like, where's the proof, right? There's never going to be any proof, right, in terms of what somebody can offer you. The person, each individual person has to follow their own path to truth and go through their own process of looking at the information, and you can't give that to another person. In fact, if somebody's asking you for proof, they're really asking you to fill a void in their psyche or in their life, right? And Gary kind of, I think, alluded to this in his own way. So then the question becomes, what's the standard of evidence that would maybe be convincing or, be relevant to this topic, right? So this is, you can see this drawing repeated in a number of places. So you've got the universe of propositions, right? So a proposition could be true, it can be false, or it could be undecidable, right? So an undecidable proposition is like, this statement is false. It has no truth value, right? I kind of think, for my own sake, and people might argue this, but I think there are undecidable propositions that do have truth value. But Gödel incompleteness suggests you're not going to get to that truth value within your formal system. You got to break out of the formal system, right? Like redefine the problem. Like Einstein often talks about the answers sometimes at a different conceptual level. So there's probably undecided propositions that do have truth value, and you might be able to ascertain those by breaking out of the box, if you will. But in the graph, what we're going to say is the orange area is truth. And everything outside that is either false or it's potentially not decidable. So I like this particular graphic as opposed to some others you see out there because that overlap between belief and truth in the purple. So that's what you would call true belief, right? Kind of harking back to Plato. But the yellow is the justified true belief. So there's a difference between believing and knowing. And this is significant in this context. And so you want to maybe move from that belief sphere into the true belief and into the justified true belief. So maybe how do we do that? There's the strength of evidence required to justify belief or meet a burden of proof has certain standards of rigor that are sort of accepted, right? And burden of proof basically would mean who has the actual responsibility to demonstrate something. And I would argue the advocate actually doesn't have that responsibility. Each individual in this case, unlike in a legal system where there's a contest, it's each individual that cares about this really has the responsibility of the burden of proof. You're not going to give that to somebody. But we could still say what standard of rigor should we apply? So reasonable suspicion, right? Standard legal definition. So it's essentially can an officer of the law stop and interrogate you or do frisk, stop and search type stuff, right? That's kind of the standard there, right? Is there a reasonable suspicion this or that has happened? It's a very low standard, is what I mean, right? Probable cause is actually in between 1 and 2, and that's you can actually be arrested. There's enough for the officer to arrest you. So that's a certain level, right? Preponderance is I've got a data set and greater than 50% of the data swings one way or another, right? And maybe that's good enough for a lot of people, right? Clear and convincing is more like the substance of the data, not necessarily the volume. There's a weighting to the likelihood that something's true based on sources and methods or how you would weigh that information. But beyond reasonable doubt is pretty much other than speculation, I have no other doubts that this is correct. It's an extremely high standard, right? So we all have our own evidentiary standard, and these are sort of the legal definitions for them, but what's the right standard to be applied? And I would kind of harken back to the crux of what this problem is by quoting Epictetus, famous, obviously, Stoic philosopher, says it's impossible to teach someone what they already know. And in some way, this is how the Intel game works. You convince somebody this is true, and then you go do the opposite, and they just can't see it. And that's kind of what the problem is with this topic. Society, culture have basically conditioned the populace to say this stuff's not true. But if you just go back to the first principles argument that I kind of went through, if you're going to if you're going to maintain neutrality like Epicurus, you'd probably have to either say it's undecided or I'd weight it toward this being more likely just because all the data points in that direction. So the problem becomes unlearning. And so I would suggest that there's actually this fifth threshold of evidence, which is what I call the threshold of unlearning, or if you want the unreasonable person standard, which is what the problem is, which is somebody's got to unlearn what they already know to be able to entertain this topic. But maybe that's actually like an achievable standard in the sense that these podcasts and these discussions and social media and the context in society that's driving the discussion will get people to at least reevaluate what they already think they know. So you're not going to give them proof, but maybe you can help them unlearn things that maybe there isn't enough data to actually weigh in on and get to more of a Epicurus kind of state. So I think this context is important for like this disclosure discussion because again, we're trying to get the government to release some information, right? So in order to get the government to do anything, you've got to kind of mobilize support to the government in the public policy arena. And then, what does disclosure actually look like in terms of people integrating that into their worldview, and how does that relate to this? So I've got a little bit of Salvador Dali here. So, is space and time kind of fungible here? Well, maybe people's perceptions are, and maybe that's an opportunity and a challenge at the same time. So I was privileged to be on a panel with Diana Polsolka. We attended the conference in Florida, the Hereticon conference that Peter Thiel had set up late last year. And so the premise of this conference was basically everybody was coming out with sort of countercultural things and very out-of-the-box thinking and very sort of avant-garde kind of stuff. But I think we mutually recognized that, like, even though it was called Hereticon, nobody actually specified what the heresies were, right? So we tried to do that in our podcast or our panel discussion. And in some sense, I would submit, at least in my view, I don't know if Diana shares this, but I think these four heresies that we came up with are really like the eigenvectors of heresies. Like all the other stuff builds out of this. These are at least intended to be, and you could decide for yourself, sort of fundamentals. So the first one was basically, surprise, surprise, non-disclosure of uncomfortable aspects of reality is a universal across all culture and time. Like UAP is an instance, right? Like it's just a modern, blip. Like this is like the way it works. Like go back to ancient Egypt, you had the inner temple and the outer temple, right? Like the people didn't even get into the temple. But if you were, fortunate enough to be like a priest or a supplicant, and you could get into the temple, which is where you're going to get like instruction, right? Their version of like a college. It's stratified. Like you don't get into the inner temple unless you meet, certain criteria, right? So they're keeping some stuff from the uninitiated. It's sort of the structure of things, right? I mean, if you want to look at, let's say, more modern example like COVID, like lab leak theory, right? Like, did that happen? Didn't it? Was the government really honest about that, right? So this occurs because aspects of reality threaten sort of the organization of society or the power structure of society. So when we think about, Condon Committee evaluating the work of Blue Book and Ed Condon basically writing the conclusions of the study before the study was done and bragging about that publicly. This is back in 1968, 1969. And then having defection of all the scholars at the University of Colorado that were working on the study, and then seeing the study published and the data and cases in the study don't match the conclusions, but the study still was used to close Project Blue Book and end the government's investigation into this topic. There's like plenty of evidence that there is like the desire to obfuscate certain topics, right? So I think that's pretty much fundamental, and we've got to put this problem in the context of that being fundamental across all human societies and all civilizations across all time. So then there's this idea of NHI exists and the reality of hierarchy of being. So I talked about why NHI exists, but this hierarchy is actually fundamental to every religious tradition, right? There's not a single religious tradition that doesn't say that there's a higher power, right? And this even traces back to shamanism, which is the most earliest form of religious or metaphysical engagement, and it occurs in every culture from the very beginning. Cave art from the Paleolithic, 15,000, 30,000 years ago, is clearly considered to have religious connotation. So all people, all cultures, all times have already believed in this hierarchy of being. And today we talk about creating, artificial general intelligence, So, is that going to be smarter than us, better than us, worse than us? Where does that fall? You've got this hierarchy. You've got the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom. And then if you've got another civilization, which I'm suggesting is the case, is that going to be exactly co-equal to us? What if it's been around 100,000 years longer than we have? What if it's been around 1 million years longer than we have? What if it's been around 2 billion years longer than we have, which there's time for? So, how does that fit in? Are they more capable in some way? So there's a certain reticence to want to accept this in the first world rationalist, modern civilizations, because essentially we've put our civilization and humankind at the top of the pyramid. Yeah, there's a hierarchy, sure, but we're at the top. Sort of secular rationalism. So it's very injurious to a complete understanding of probably how reality works, right? So the second, third world developing nations don't have this problem. Indigenous cultures don't have this problem. The medieval era didn't have this problem. But only like the secular West really has this problem. And I would submit it's a huge impediment, and it's part of the context for why this problem remains. People can't engage with this because it threatens their worldview. So then, this is totally central to Diana's work. Cosmism was a motivating factor in both the US and USSR space programs. And so why is that relevant? Well, you could argue really that those programs drove like the scientific enterprise that has created the world that we're living in. So the basis tech, we also say space program tech, space age tech, that was a long, long time ago. But really, we still kind of view our society as being, accelerated out of that. So the Jack Parsons of the world, Tchaikovskys and Soviet Union, they really were driven by like an esoteric view. And I would submit then, therefore, that esotericism actually drives scientific advancement. It's like the antithesis of what most people believe. It's like, mysticism is the adversary of science. Like the esoteric tradition actually drives it. So I think it's very important to maybe understand that. And then this idea of consciousness playing a role in both physics and metaphysics. And what I mean by that, I would submit that it's sort of the work by Hameroff and Penrose on the orchestrated objective reduction idea of how consciousness really works is moving us toward an actual physics-based theory of consciousness. I'm a big, opponent, if you will, of the strong form of the Church-Turing thesis, right? So, everybody knows Alan Turing, famous British computer scientist, came up with the formalism for the Turing machine, which is the basis for the theoretical foundation for computability. Alonzo Church was his graduate advisor. He was actually an American logistician. And so everybody was trying to figure out this concept of computability. And you had Kurt Gödel weighing in. You had like the System S kind of framework. You had Cantor with lambda calculus. You had Turing. Ultimately, Church threw in with his graduate student and said, okay, I'll accept that the Turing machine formalism is equivalent to the set of computable functions. This is almost like it's a tautology. It's a definition. It's called the Church-Turing thesis. And so people wanted to expand on that thesis. And so they came up with a strong form. They wanted to expand it to random and human theoretic kind of computation. And in the logic, there's a lot of ways to kind of frame this, and a lot of people are familiar with this, but I'll run through it quickly. The idea was that if I can express myself in a natural language, like we're doing right now, English, and English can be related to a mathematical formal system, with rules of grammar. So, if I'm, breaking the rules of grammar, you tell me, right? We've got a consensus reality on that. Then, in some sense, I could program that into a computer because it's a formal system, and that creates some sort of equivalence between anything I can think of and what I can program in the computer. So that's essentially the strong form of the Church-Turing thesis, which is the intellectual foundation for general purpose AI. And you're like, okay, why would you disagree with that? It makes sense, right? But I would submit, in common conversation, in literature, in poetry, we're always breaking the rules of grammar. The idioms, contractions, colloquialism, slang, incorrect grammar in poetry, like we're breaking out of the formal system because we can't communicate what we want to communicate. We're changing the rules. We're breaking the box. We're basically constrained by Gödeling completeness, but we're basically going around that by reframing the formal system. And then you could argue, well, there's certain ineffable things anyway that I might experience that I can't even communicate like in any kind of formal language. So I would submit that the Church-Turing thesis, in the strong form in particular, is certainly not demonstrated in any way, but I would really suggest that it's wrong. And so that's my personal view. But so what it suggests then is consciousness basically is maybe not based on like Turing machine architecture, because a Turing machine architecture doesn't comport with free will. And so there's no way to have like moral value if you're not making choices between good and evil. So to me, that's very epistemologically fundamental. But as we come to a deeper understanding of consciousness that may be based on non-computable principles, like the Stewart-Hameroff principles, or maybe some others, then we might, in fact, be able to develop technologies that could create actual artificial intelligence, or could create technologies where we embed really truly thinking capability and moral value into our technology, or into our ability to interact with that technology as a sentient being. And so that's what we sort of mean. Consciousness isn't just part of the like esoteric and metaphysical experience, but it can be brought under the aegis of some sort of expanded science. And once we do that, then we can engineer with that. So these things, I think, are heretical in the sense that people don't accept them, and it results in really a firewalling off of whole aspects of reality. And you know, our sort of I'll go back. Yeah, there we go. So I would submit that this idea of an agnosticism is really not a viable worldview, because you're missing these aspects of reality that are essential to an integrated picture. And frankly, any more advanced civilization that we might be dealing with in the context of NHI and UAP would have already got to this state. And in order to try to understand that, engage with it, you know, we've got to appreciate that. The other concept is, you know, their science has probably progressed to the point where they can do these type of engineering capabilities, and we may be experiencing that as well. Technologies that have sentience. So this is the context then within which we've got to deal with this conversation, and in which we've got to deal with the potential for government disclosure. So some people that have heard me talk before have seen this slide. This is what I call the UAP campaign plan slide. So being Army and government, like, we got to have plans, and we got to have a campaign plan. And so a campaign plan is probably best thought about as like a meta plan. I call it a meta plan. It's like a plan about a plan, right? So you're not getting the plan, you're getting the meta plan. But so what's the meta plan? There's sort of these 5 phases, you know, conceptually, and then we'll go through. There's sort of five lines of effort, which are what you would like to develop the detailed plan out of. So phases 1 through 5, just to sort of kind of run through, like, demonstrate UAP existence, correlate UAP signature, characterize UAP performance, determine UAP nature, and then sort of this engagement, like where you ultimately want to go. So why have this plan? I think there's sort of 3 things that, in the context of like government disclosure, is what we're trying to do. We want to restore proper oversight, right? And there's enough public discussion, even though, you know, President Trump said, you know, UAP real, Barack Obama said UAP real. You know, how much do the presidents really know about this, and how much are they really in control of what's happening as far as what the government's doing? And, you know, where is the centralization of all this information? And that probably hasn't happened, right? There's like a lack of oversight. You know, the authority may have started in the executive, but it kind of shifted and drifted out. So we've got a real problem in a democratic society and a representative democracy of the people that we're putting in charge are not like running the show. And unless and until like this root cause of the problem is rectified, you know, the deep state, if you will, the military industrial complex, whatever terminology you want to use, is probably going to regrow out of that. So, you know, the strategic end state and why we would do all these steps is like we need to, you know, kind of get there and restore that oversight. But interestingly, in order to do that, you got to do a certain amount of disclosure, right? Like you got to kind of tell more people about it so they can get a handle on it, particularly like key leaders that are elected. And then like, okay, now they know about it and maybe they're in charge, but oh my gosh, like we got to do something about it. Like the actual problem, like what are NHI doing and what does this mean for our society and how do we incorporate this into our worldview? So you want to advance society and scientific understanding. So those three things actually are cyclic. They're like, like stair-stepping. I got to do a little disclosure. I get a get more oversight. Get a little more oversight. I can bring more people in to solve the problem. I get more people in to solve the problem, and I find out like I didn't have all the oversight needed. So like it's sort of a cyclic process that that's sort of interspersed with greater and greater degrees of disclosure. Like ultimately, it gets out to the public. So if I go back then to this sort of phase one, demonstrate UAP existence, what I'm trying to do is essentially convince enough key leadership to put in place mechanisms where I can start getting a handle on the problem so I can get proper oversight. How do we actually get to this stage? Like before this problem was even like a legitimate topic of discussion, you had this sort of phase zero all the way on the left there. And it's probably worthwhile to kind of point that out. Like those, I'm just using a very small subset, but the National Institute for Discovery Science, right, in Bigelow Aerospace. So we've got Eric W. Davis here and attending this conference, like a key figure in NIDS, along with Colm Kelleher and many other people, Hal Puthoff, right? That was a key foundational element to make this topic successful. Anybody that hasn't met Eric really needs to go talk with him because he's a key pillar here. So then you had AWSAP, right, the Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Application Program, right? So Jay Stratton, very much involved in that. Jim Lukotsky, Travis Taylor, right? Another big step, like very important names, right, that were responsible for this. And then the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, Lou Elizondo testified before Congress, wrote the book Eminent, like pillar figure, right? The DoD video release, Chris Mellon, instrumental in making that happen, principal. Leslie Kean is here in the conference, right? The New York Times article, everybody alluded to that earlier, right? So tremendous contribution. And UAP Task Force, David Grush, right? Testified before Congress. Huge contribution. So those actions allowed us to even entertain the idea of this plan, and this plan then hopefully to solidify the idea of doing disclosure. So this phase one, if you look at the top, we're like in this, if you look at the color code there, those milestones, like we're kind of behind the power curve, right, in terms of how I'm sort of assessing it. We're kind of off target. And so part of that is that the legislative agenda for the UAP Disclosure Act that Senator Schumer and Senator Rounds had proposed, hasn't passed. And so I want to kind of comment here too, because this is like very important, like these sort of unsung heroes. I mentioned this in my first Seoul talk a couple years ago, that it was the permanent staff members in the SASC and the SISI, like a very, very small group, like an elite group, people that are really not only at the top of their career and extremely effective politically navigating a very difficult bipartisan environment over decades, and sort of selfless servants and like silent professionals making all this happen. And so we've got one of those in the audience today. Kirk McConnell is in attendance at this conference, and so Kirk is retired out of government now, but I would submit, all of the legislative agenda that we've seen happen was in large part due to Kirk driving that. Now, he had a team. There was a team, and these people aren't public, so I'm not going to mention their names out of discretion. So there are other people involved, for sure, that were very, very important as well. I don't want to diminish that. But Kirk had the drive and the tact and the ability to basically navigate a system that's like designed to prevent this happening. And so when he left government, like we haven't seen anything since. So people really need to go up and shake Kirk's hand for making like tremendous things happen, like history making things happen. But yeah. And you don't hear Kirk's name enough, and it's sad because the key people are like in the shadows, really, in the background. So I would submit, though, that like this Disclosure Act, maybe I should talk about this a little bit. So the idea of the Disclosure Act, that you had like 6 people sign up for this, both the majority leader at the time, Schumer, and the majority leader at the time, Senator Rounds on the SASC, you had Senator Rubio, you had Senator Gillibrand, right? So you've got the people on the SISI, you've got Young and Heinrich. So you had 6 senators signing up to this, completely bipartisan. And it got passed ultimately by the Senate to be put in NDA 23, National Defense Authorization Act in 23. And so the idea of this amendment was to create a control group, really recreating probably what was originally done back by the greatest generation, Truman and Eisenhower, after the war, to get a handle on this topic, but doing it in such a way that it would be accountable to Congress and it would be publicly known. And this group would work for the president directly. And so that was the first part. And then the second part was all the information on this topic would have to be centralized in the National Archive and made accessible to this group. And then this group would be chartered to evaluate and develop like a UAP disclosure campaign plan that would address all the ramifications of having to disclose this. And then ultimately, because I would argue, and I think Senator Rounds actually argues this, by the way, there's a recent documentary coming up, The Age of Disclosure. Dan Farah developed this documentary. It was screened at South by Southwest last month. Senator Rounds is in that documentary, among many other senior leaders. In fact, Tim Gallaudet is in that documentary as well, and Senator Rubio. But Senator Rounds has a section in that documentary where he explicitly talks about the Disclosure Amendment and the importance of eminent domain as being central to his premise for getting control of what's going on, which is to say, take this stuff back that we loaned out to private aerospace, bring it back under government control, because like ultimately that's the center of gravity for demonstrating this. And then you can build out from there what the ramifications are. So that's sort of the amendment, and if you're going to sort of put that in this framework, like that amendment should have already passed. So that's why like this phase 1 is sort of off target. So Senator Rounds has talked about and asserted that he's going to reintroduce that this year. And I would submit that that's like not optional if you want to get the government to do what we want them to do. There's no way that this can be assigned as an additional duty to some other organization. There's no way that you can, let's say, take one individual and make them a czar and put them in charge of this thing. You need people that are practitioners in the instruments of national power, that have demonstrated their proficiency at cabinet deputy level, that are working directly for the president, and essentially have this emergent interaction between the different perspectives of diplomatic, military, economic, financial, intelligence, information, law enforcement, and political perspectives that practitioners of the different instruments of power would have to bring to advise the president on what to do about this. And so until that structure is put in place, I would say that we're not going to make progress in terms of the government doing what we want. So that would be kind of what's supposed to happen in phase 1. The other thing that was supposedly happening in phase 1, and we've seen this historically, is sort of a proliferation of hypotheses around the topic. And Hal Puthoff talks about this in his ultra-terrestrial paper that was referenced yesterday too, and I'd recommend anybody that's interested go read that. He basically takes a sort of a unpopular theory and kind of fleshes it out. It's very interesting. But I would think in my view, the more important takeaway from his paper was essentially we're doing like the wrong approach here. We're basically proliferating our own theories and we're never like making progress. So what we probably need to do is make an intellectual commitment to a specific theory and then use a forensic approach to like take theories off the table. Like disprove the theories so we can like say it's not this, it's not that, right? And narrow it down because frankly like all the theories are still on the table. And I'll maybe talk about some of those, what I've used, sort of what the table looks like. So this first stage has basically been a proliferation of theories. The forensic approach really not so much has happened. the collection strategy has been reactive. Like we've got systems, we've got capabilities, we've got experiencers. They encounter this, it's sort of maybe haphazard, and we get the best information we can out of that and we make do, but it's not ideal. So then we go into this sort of second phase, which is correlate signatures. So let's say we get this amendment passed and we get a little more resource, right? We get more attention put on this. This is a stair-step process. So maybe we can have some sort of persistent collection. And now I'm thinking more like, government systems, right? Like in other words, instead of just catching things incidentally, maybe I develop some approach where I'm truly trying to focus on certain areas in a persistent way and in a methodical way. And then I'm doing this thing that Hal Puthoff talked about, which is let's try to eliminate hypotheses, just as a first step, right? And you can see at the bottom, what we're trying to do is more and more target audiences, if you will, are maybe being made aware of more and more information, and you're stair-stepping disclosure through sort of an iterative process. Like in the first stage, key leaders, maybe it's non-public. This has already sort of happened. I said these 6 senators, several in the Gang of 8, who are really the most highly briefed people, have said this is real. We need to look into it. We're not getting told the truth, right? So the first phase, to some degree, we've accomplished that, but not sufficiently to move the legislation through the House. The second stage, really, you're trying to get maybe academia, National Science Foundation. You can start working through, government grants in the academy. And so maybe in phase 3, somewhere between phase 2 and 3, maybe there's this thing called the Enhanced UAP Whistleblower Protection Act that kind of Congress has asked about, and which would basically incentivize more whistleblowers to come forward through a formalized process. So the Disclosure Act puts in place the control structure and centralizes the information, but in order to accelerate that process, then you need to get more whistleblowers to come forward. So you've got sort of a second stage of the legislative agenda that probably has to happen, Congress's role. But then you've got, what can we do in terms of the academy, and Wes is here from Galileo. They're already starting to do this. Let's build tailored systems so we can use a proactive data collection approach. We're not just going to take our existing systems and we'll make it more persistent. Well, we're going to actually build systems that are tailored or are designed to go after this problem. So, maybe we want to basically do that, and maybe the government ought to do that. And so at that point, maybe you're getting to the point where you're getting this public acceptance, and you've got, let's say, a truth and reconciliation process, and you finally get to this post-disclosure stage, right? And so your eminent domain function is sort of tracking through the same process where you've got the stuff that's outside proper oversight. You exercise eminent domain and bring it under proper oversight. You basically make it available to what Gary talked about, a public-private partnership or a competitively selected consortium. Maybe they're working that behind the green door, if you will, in terms of a secure environment. But ultimately, you learn something from that. You bring a bigger brain trust in, and you develop a means of regulating the market so you could actually turn it back over then to more of a capitalist system, right? So this is that's the government frame, right? So people are okay, great, what can we do? And so you've got these lines of effort, which these other 5 lines of effort here, 5 total, the other 4. The purple ones are what I call the indirect or external path. These are the things that lower the barrier to entry for the government to do what we want, right? So, disclosure isn't happening because of national security, because of lack of a plan, because of societal disruption, because of the possible covert agreements that might be in place, because of the possibility that they're covering up misdeeds, and because there's just organizational intransigence, and I got other priorities, right? So those are the 6 reasons. But the big reason is national security, encompasses all of them. So what we want to do is contract the national security reason to, let's say, nuclear, the analog of nuclear weapons versus the analog to nuclear energy, where nuclear energy is available. And so in order to do that, you got to solve the lack of a plan and societal disruption issues. And so And so those issues are actually not government issues. They're like really private sector issues. And they can be worked in the private sector by professionalizing this topic. And that then lowers the barrier to entry for the government to basically just adopt those plans that are developed in the private sector. So the humanities, the natural sciences, industry and society, medicine, there are all these things that can be done in those lanes to develop the plan for the government. And as those conversations become increasingly serious, then that's sort of self-disclosure in itself. And oh, by the way, you're making progress on the problem. And so this is sort of the central core on how I think the academy can help and civil society can help. So maybe that's sort of a frame to where we want to go, how we might get there. I presented at Seoul, I presented at Seoul what I call the Hilbert problems. David Hilbert, famous German mathematician, 1900, framed the way forward for mathematics by presenting 10 kind of problems that tried to frame the discipline. He ultimately had like 23 problems, and they found one posthumously. It's interesting, like the problems were actually found, some of them were found to be ill-formed, some were like, really unsolvable because they were not formed correctly. Some were trivial, they were solved immediately. Some of them are like the hardest problems out there, Riemann hypothesis with prime numbers, like, 100 more years later, they're still not solved. So Hilbert didn't quite get it right. But the point is, I think we need a set of Hilbert problems. And I may or may not have time to kind of present my sort of list here, but we need Hilbert problems to frame the discipline. And with the intent of what I just described. So let's talk about like these origin hypotheses really quick because I'm running out of time. So this is just one person's taxonomy. The idea is like maybe I can find all the corner cases if I can create a taxonomy on how this might work. So I'm kind of break it down into physical, psychosocial, metaphysical. The physical breaks down into like intra-dimensional, extra-dimensional, interdimensional. So intra-dimensional is basically, the solution is somewhere in our three-dimensional space, intra-dimensional. So basically you've got this prosaic kind of, it's natural or human-made, right? And the disclosure amendment gets into this when it talks about this idea of temporarily non-attributed object. And this is actually very important. Like all those prosaic things, they're actually like actual explanations. Like, depending on where you kind of come down on the problem, 80 to 90% of Blue Book cases were prosaic. Like most of their time was spent on prosaic stuff. AARO, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, like most of their time spent on prosaic stuff. So the disclosure amendment actually separated the two and said UAP are not temporarily non-attributed object. Temporarily non-attributed object is something that has a prosaic attribution, but I just can't identify it at the moment of observation due to limitations of the observer or the process. But I can figure it out ultimately. So you can kind of take those off the table. Then you got the crypto-terrestrial hypothesis. I probably have to move through these quick. That's your, like Atlantis theory, right? Or the Silurian hypothesis, which there's just a paper written about. So you've got, proto-human civilization that reached some kind of advanced technology, or you've got, something from deep time that was wiped out. Most people say that's crazy, like ridiculous, right? But if you look at the climatic events that were, let's say, 4 orders of magnitude worse than Katrina. So like Hurricane Katrina destroyed a city. Well, what if there was a climatic event that destroyed 10,000 cities in the modern world? Like, how would that affect civilizations? Like, so 10,000 cities on the coast destroyed. Like, that would be a significant impact to 21st century civilization. There have been 16 climatic events that have been worse than that just in the last 100,000 years. So if you had any kind of like reasonable civilization, it would be destroyed. So there's been like resets at least 16 times. Now that doesn't say, I'm not advocating there's some Atlantis, civilization or whatever, but it's not as far-fetched as maybe it first seems. So then the other one's the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Everybody's familiar with that. I would say that has the advantage of maybe needing the least assumptions in some sense. I mean, it doesn't make it right, but you probably have the least set of assumptions. Jacques Vallée's famous for saying, like, I hope it's not that because it'd be boring. But, so maybe that's true. But if you can manipulate consciousness and, the nature of reality, like, that could probably explain a lot of what's happening. All right, so that's that one. The extra-dimensional one is basically like, okay, the model of the universe is basically, we've got like a four-dimensional hypersphere. The radius of the hypersphere is time. That sphere is sort of expanding. The surface of the sphere is our three-dimensional space. Well, what if like that hypersphere was embedded in a higher dimensional space? Then you could have, beings coming in from that higher dimensional space, right? In theory, at least, right? Or it might be coming from these compactified dimensions, like dimensions that are actually in our like three-dimensional space, but we don't see them because they're sort of rolled up somehow, right? So in theory, like that could happen, right? Or you've got this idea in string theory of like a brain. You've got this higher dimensional structure, and so that is either passing through our space as a shadow, or they've got like an avatar that's representing them in our space, or there's some sort of three-dimensional entity that migrates from this higher dimensional bulk into our dimension, right? So that's kind of that. Interdimensional, this is the whole time travel hypothesis stuff. So the psychosocial, right? So, this is sociological, psychological, and neurological. So just take example, sociological, like hoax, right? The sociological, mimetic virus, something goes viral, so it shapes people's perception, right? Disinformation, right? Psychological, I just have, my own belief system. I just choose to believe this or that, may or may not be true. My memory is fallible. I've got, Carl Jung's collective unconscious, like I'm kind of channeling some of this stuff, right? Neurological, like gets into the psychedelic, the traumatic, the higher functioning, the implants potentially. So there's all range of reasons. And then the metaphysical, the paranormal, which I kind of argue is like something that might be amenable to like, logical investigation aspects of nature that we could understand. It's like extensions of physics, if you will. Psychotronics is in there. ND, OB, like near-death experience, mediumship. Occult is more like purposely hidden powers of nature. Like maybe there's aspects of reality that like are purposely hidden, just how the structure of the world works. So, this idea of creating control and modeling something against control like science requires. I mean, you may not believe that, but like in principle, that could be the case. We don't know. And then transcendental is sort of more like, your religious and, divine type things. And then I would argue too, like the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis. And interestingly, I think Hal didn't actually define ultra-terrestrial. So I kind of define it as, any sentient life form, regardless of origin, ultimate origin, that's residing covertly, in our environment, right? Land, sea, air, space. That's not related to, modern day civilization or known antecedents. So it's like, Venn diagram over this, right? So this is maybe a taxonomy that could be enhanced, break this down a couple of other levels, renormalize it back up, define these boxes, and then turn this into an ontology where I've got one thing on one far end of the chart and another thing on another far end of the chart, and they kind of very closely are the same. And I could essentially evaluate the sum total of cases in a probabilistic manner as to whether they fit into one or more of these boxes and create ultimately like a heat map by summing over all the cases probabilistically to see if I've got nodes that are more consistent across a range of cases that might suggest that one or more of these is either more prevalent or more likely to be the case. But let me bring it back to sort of the epistemological idea. There's sort of an epistemological overlay on this chart, which is, and Gary talked about this, he sort of zoomed in on this part. This is the part that's amenable to mathematical encapsulation, like the normal scientific method. Like, I'm going to write a formula, I can do analysis, I can basically do hard science here, right? So that's that subset in blue. But, there's this sort of psychosocial part. It depends on the free will of the actors. And so, maybe it's amenable to the scientific method, but I can't really write an equation on what a person's going to do or what an NHI is going to do, right? So it's, I'm expanding the set. Then I talked about paranormal. Well, maybe formal logic applies, but the scientific method really doesn't. Like, I can't create a control experiment because I can't isolate the observer from the experiment. I got to do something different, right? So you may believe that set's a null set, but from first principles,
it could be, there could be a lot in there. And then I would argue like the occult, these things that might be purposely hidden might only be amenable to the sort of internal introspection that all these esoteric faith traditions sort of suggest, this internal discovery, meditative, et cetera. So that's based on access to inner knowledge. And then finally, the purely divine, like you're not going to find out about that. It's not amenable to science at all. There's going to have to be some kind of divine revelation, right? So some of these sets might be the null set, and some of them might not be, but I would submit that, we don't have enough information. And maybe there's like more than one thing going on that we've sort of confused. So let me go real quick. So I've got only a couple minutes. So this idea of technological singularity comes up. I've already suggested I'm not a big fan of Kurzweil's idea that AI is the technological singularity. This graphic is from Forbidden Planet, a famous 1956 movie. So it's called The Great Machine. And The Great Machine is basically doing what Gary was talking about, alluding to this morning about apports. It's like making something real out of vacuum potential. So the Great Machine of the Krell basically did that in the movie, and basically did that psychotronically, like people's brains were connected to the machine and they could think something and it would appear. In fact, this movie is actually getting reshown this month in LA for the first time in whatever, 70 years. So it's a very famous movie, and it's worth watching. The plot of the movie is based on Shakespeare's Tempest. It's a very good study in command. It's a very good sci-fi movie. It's very good in a number of ways. But I would suggest conservation laws drive Darwinian competition. And because of that, technological singularity really implies the state at which all sentient beings are driving toward, whether it's us, NHI, or AGI, actual AGI, which is to get to post-scarcity. Like these conservation laws aren't limiting you, right? And so to me, that's technological singularity, and it's highly unstable, and it results in either some kind of transcendence, it results in retreat to a more simple pastoral existence, or it results in collapse and destruction. So to me, this is the actual danger. And I don't think we're anywhere near it. But that may have affected other civilizations, or they may be on a path like we are to collide in terms of this competitive nature. In other words, I'm suggesting that altruism is a luxury that doesn't really come in, true altruism, until you're at post-scarcity. And probably if you're at post-scarcity, you either transcended already or you collapsed. So probably nobody's really completely altruistic, and we've got to think about things in terms of competition and ultimately maybe how you can collaborate even though you may not have objectives that completely align. So this is sort of my pet peeve, that Kardashev scale is really, which is based on something developed in 1964 by the astronomer Kardashev, based on ranking civilizations on their energy usage. Right, type 1, 2, 3, I can use all the energy on a planet, all the energy on the sun, all the energy in a galaxy. That's kind of the accepted model. Carl Sagan talks about it a lot. I think it's totally inadequate. I'm suggesting we need to dispense with that and develop what I call the universal civilization development model. And this helps to sort of understand and frame the problem. So you'd have these three axes that would align with kind of how we do with computer authentication. What I have, what I know, who I am. What I have, what I know, who I am. So what I have is some kind of ID card. What I know is some kind of password, and who I am is my ID or retina print, right? So we got these axes. So instead of magnitude of energy usage, it's really about energy density. The physics of energy. If I can get a certain energy density, I can make fire. If I get more energy density, I can create the ability to smelt metals. I can do nuclear fission. I can do nuclear fusion. Maybe I can change the laws of physics by affecting things at the Planck scale. So ultimately, that would be a better indicator of their technology, and also potentially the what they're able to do. Then there's the information complexity scale. What do they know about the nature of reality? Jacques Vallée talks about this physics of information, right? Ultimately, how much complexity can they manage? So, in some sense, if I could build a Dyson sphere to get to type 2, maybe once I know enough, I would never do that because it's not smart. So there's like, these are orthogonal axes actually. And then finally, like what's their relationship to their environment? So I think all these things sort of contribute to say there's a Hamming distance, you know, to use like electromagnetic, electrical engineer term, or separation of these civilizations in this hyperspace, this phase space. And the closer they are, you know, these civilizations might be in this phase space, the more likely they're occupying the same competitive niche, and in which case they'd be in competition. The further apart they are, maybe you've got this better opportunity for cooperation, or the more likely possibility for altruism. And actually this transcendence idea might happen technologically along the first axis, or spiritually along the second axis, or potentially evolutionary along the third axis, and maybe that's kind of like how it works. So I'm getting told I'm kind of got to conclude. So, I mean, thank you for your time. That was kind of the gist of it. I think I probably need to turn it back over, right? I've exceeded my time. So thank you very much.